The shadows of Ridgewood. Ridgewood was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where life moved slowly and uneventfully. It was the type of neighborhood that seemed frozen in time, quaint, safe, and full of routine. The children played on the streets, the elderly waved from their porches, and gossip was the local sport. But that was before the disappearances started. It began with little things. A missing cat, a dog found dead in someone's backyard, or a neighbor who didn't return calls. Nothing too unusual, at least not until Mrs. Harker vanished. Mrs. Harker was the kind of old lady you couldn't help but notice. She was always out in her garden, pruning her roses and chatting with passers-by. So when she stopped appearing at her usual time, people grew concerned. Her house was the first place everyone searched. Her door was locked, the windows closed, and no sign of struggle. The police chalked it up to her having left for a trip, perhaps without telling anyone. But the neighborhood knew better. Mrs. Harker would never leave without telling a soul. The whispers started soon after. People began locking their doors at night. The air felt thick with tension, and then, 2 days later, Kyle Miller went missing. Kyle was a teenager, a troublemaker, but not the kind to simply vanish. His mother found his bike abandoned near the park, its tires spinning in the breeze. Panic spread through the streets like wildfire. Meetings were held, patrols organized, but there were no clues. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed them whole. 3 weeks, 3 more disappearances. No pattern, no connection. Old, young, man, woman, it didn't matter. The killer left nothing behind. The police came up with no leads, and soon they stopped coming. It was a ghost case, they said. But the people of Ridgewood knew the truth. Someone among them was responsible. Among the few who still dared to walk outside after dark was Emma. She was a single woman in her early 30s, living alone in a house at the edge of the neighborhood. She had always been the curious type, and something about the disappearances didn't sit right with her. Emma knew it had to be someone local, someone who knew the area too well. Her mind raced through possibilities, but everyone seemed innocent enough. Except for one person, Mr. Loring. Mr. Loring had moved into Ridgewood 6 months ago. He was quiet, unassuming, and always kept to himself. He lived in the last house on the street, the one no one paid attention to, and that's what bothered Emma the most. In a town where everyone knew each other's business, Mr. Loring was a mystery. One evening, while the autumn wind howled outside, Emma decided to confront her suspicions. She watched Mr. Loring's house from her window, waiting. The streets were empty, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. It was the kind of night where shadows moved on their own. At midnight, she saw him. Mr. Loring stepped out of his house, dressed in black, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. He moved silently, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Emma's heart raced as she followed him, keeping her distance. He walked swiftly, past the rows of houses, toward the park, where Kyle had disappeared. Something cold crawled down her spine as she realized where he was headed, Mrs. Harker's house. Emma crouched behind a row of bushes, watching as Mr. Loring approached the side door. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a small silver key. A key to Mrs. Harker's house. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The door creaked open, and Mr. Loring disappeared inside. For a moment, Emma considered going back. She could call the police, tell them what she saw, but something urged her forward. She crept toward the house, her footsteps silent on the wet grass. She reached the door and, with trembling hands, pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The house was dark, save for a dim light flickering from the basement. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. Each step felt heavier than the last as she descended the creaky stairs. The light grew brighter, revealing a makeshift room below. And then she saw it. Shelves lined with jars, each one filled with strange, discolored objects. Organs, flesh, pieces of people. Her stomach churned as she realized the horrifying truth. These were trophies, the missing neighbors, reduced to grotesque keepsakes. And then she saw him, Mr. Loring, standing in the corner, sharpening a long, glinting knife. Emma's breath hitched as he turned toward her, his eyes cold, devoid of emotion. "You weren't supposed to find this," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. Emma stumbled back, her mind racing for an escape. But before she could run, he lunged, grabbing her wrist with a strength that felt inhuman. She fought, kicking and screaming, but it only seemed to amuse him. "I like you, Emma," he whispered, tightening his grip. "You're smart, too smart." In a moment of desperate clarity, Emma reached for a jar on the nearest shelf and smashed it against his head. The glass shattered, sending him staggering back. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of his footsteps close behind. Bursting through the front door, she screamed for help, but the streets were silent. No one came. She could feel him closing in, his breath hot on her neck. Her vision blurred with fear, but just as his hand grabbed her shoulder, she spun around, slashing at him with a shard of glass she'd held onto. Mr. Loring fell to the ground, blood pouring from the wound, and for a moment, everything was still. Emma stood over him, gasping for breath, her hands trembling. She didn't stop to think. She ran. She didn't know where, but anywhere was safer than here. She didn't care that she was barefoot, that she was bleeding. All that mattered was getting away. It wasn't until she collapsed on a neighbor's porch, sobbing and shaking, that she realized it was over. Mr. Loring was dead, or at least she hoped he was. The police found his body the next morning, along with the grotesque trophies in the basement. Ridgewood was never the same after that. The news called him a serial killer, but to Emma and the rest of the town, he would always be the shadow that had haunted their streets, the monster lurking just out of sight. But as the months passed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The disappearances had stopped, yes, but there was something about the way Mr. Loring had spoken to her in those final moments, as if he wasn't the only one, as if there was more to fear. And then one night, she found a note under her door. 3 words, written in a shaky hand: "We are many."